Hey, thanks for tuning in. Lars has joined me to do another series, this time on Horary Astrology, and we're going to run through the examples of William Lilly that he has given in his text on Horary Astrology. Thanks so much for Lars for joining, and you can contact both of us through the links that I've posted on the description page. And yeah, good to go, Lars.
Cool. Great. So yeah, we'll be studying the chart examples from this book, Christian Astrology. And this particular edition has volumes 1 and 2. Volume 1 is an introduction to the core elements of astrology, the core techniques, significations. And volume 2 is a very advanced, thorough treatise on horary astrology. You can actually teach yourself horary astrology from this book alone. Although I would definitely recommend purchasing John Frawley's The Horary Textbook, very, very excellent book, as well as Oscar Hoffman's Classical Medical Astrology, because we're going to actually be going over William Lilly's, one of his medical horary charts today. And so I would say with those 2 books, 3 if you're interested in the medical one, you can teach yourself horary. That's actually what I did. That's how I taught myself horary astrology, through those books, these 3-4 books, and then I just practiced it a lot. So I think there's great value in taking courses in horary astrology, but you might want to try this self-study method first. It'll also be a lot cheaper, and you'll have to be more creative and clever, because you won't necessarily have a teacher to bounce things off of, but you can post it in forums on Facebook. There's some good horary forums on Facebook. skyscript.co.uk, run by Deborah Holding, is also a great resource. There's a great forum there as well, where you can post stuff and ask questions about things. But I just wanted to throw that out there, since this is the first video we're doing in this series. And we're going to kind of just get into the meat of it. This isn't a series where we're explaining how to do horary from the ground up. This is a series where we're just analyzing and commenting on Lilly's example horary questions that he provides in his book, just for fun, basically, and so that people studying horary may have another resource to go to. And I just want to say real quick, this is one of the only books where the author gives a plethora of examples of how to delineate. He really goes into detail. A lot of classical authors, they don't offer much, Guido Bonatti, for example, in his it's 1,000-page treatise that he wrote on astrology, probably has less charts as examples than Lilly does in this much shorter text, So the old authors weren't big on putting too many examples in their text, which is really unfortunate, because it would be fun to see more of this in classical text. But anyway, that's just a side note. So yeah, do you want to share the screen so we can look at this chart?
Yeah.
Great.
Here you go.
Cool. So Lilly has given this chart in his book in chapter 46, which comes after chapters 44 and 45, which are also about disease and death and whatnot. And this is the second example chart he gives for delineating this questions concerning disease and death. And the question was whether the sick would live or die, and what his disease was. And this was I believe this was quite a common thing that Lilly was asked by people about disease, because Lilly was also a physician himself. So he was very medically capable, pretty amazing individual in many respects. And he has given July 16th, 1645 at 7:22 a.m. But this is obviously a mistake in the date, because when we calculate it in the modern day, we get this exact chart on July 26th at 7:30 a.m. So the 8-minute difference can be accounted for simply as the fact that the time measuring methods back then were not as precise. But I really do think Lilly just maybe just accidentally wrote 16th instead of 26th. And so it's not really a big deal once we know that. But I just wanted to alert people to that. And Lilly used, I believe, Regiomontanus houses, and so
Yeah.
that's what we've computed here. And so, so yeah, we're gonna jump into it. I'm just gonna read what Lilly himself has written, and then we're gonna just kind of pause to talk about it a little bit here and there. It's not very long. This is one of his shorter examples. Actually, it's only about a page. So we begin. The sign ascending was Virgo. Is in this figure most afflicted by the corporeal presence of Mars, who is partly lord of the 8th house. Therefore, from that house and sign must we require the disease, cause, and member grieved. So what he's saying here is that he's actually kind of inadvertently using whole sign houses. Lilly didn't use whole sign houses as far as I can tell, but he's basically employing that logic because A, the 8th cusp is at the very end of Pisces, and the majority of the 8th quadrant house is Aries. But not only that, Aries is the natural 8th house to a Virgo ascendant if we use whole signs. So we do see him really thinking outside the box quite a bit in this book, and this is a good example of that. And so he's taking Mars as the core cause, right? Because Mars is ruling this malefic 8th house, and Mars is also in the ascendant and with the moon, which always signifies a lot about the body and the state of the person with regard to medical questions, simply because the moon rules all the fluids in the body, and also because the moon has to do with our basically our lower mind, so to speak. And this also translates to the energy body, the etheric body. While the sun could be said to rule vitality, the moon could be said to be a symbol of the subtle body, the etheric body, whatever you want to call it, but this subtle body that is like the blueprint of the physical form. Okay, so that's how I look at it, at least. Okay, so then he goes on to say Aquarius, being the sign of the 6th, is fixed, afflicted by the south node, and Saturn, who is lord of the 6th house, is in Taurus, a fixed sign, earthly and melancholy, the same nature of Virgo, the sign ascending. So we already have, what he's pointing out here is like we have basically malefic 8th lord in Virgo rising with the moon, so earthy melancholic, which is one of the 4 humors of Greek medicine. And then Saturn, lord of the 6th, is also in a melancholic sign, and in a fixed sign, which is a very stubborn disease. There's a very stubborn disease. So we know from the nature of the 6th, the general nature of the disease, according to the methodology Lilly's employing here. There are other methodologies, and Oscar Hoffman in his book Classical Medical Astrology employs a different one than Lilly is employing here, but in my experience both work quite well, so I won't go into that, but I just wanted to alert people if they decide to get that book that there's a slightly different methodology. Anyway, so yeah, we have from the 6th like a fairly stubborn, entrenched, slow disease, right? Possibly very resistant because it's Saturn and it's in a fixed sign. And this is echoing the testimony we get from Mars, Moon, and Ascendant.
Yeah, and usually fixed signs, if they're if 6th house is a fixed sign, I think any disease that a person is going to contract at that particular point of time, when the 6th lord is activated or something, is going to stick to them, and it's kind of very, very indicative in horary chart. And
yes.
And Taurus is also a fixed sign, which is again super interesting. And Saturn always kind of emphasizes and deals with fixation of things.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we see a nice logic unfolding already, very simple stuff, which is why I like this book and I like Lilly so much, because he's very simple, and the methods he used, they work very well. So then he says, the moon, a general significatrix, meaning significator in Latin, in all diseases, being afflicted by her proximity to Mars, right, within just 2 degrees, and placed in the ascendant in an earthly melancholic sign, together with the other significators, right, did portend the patient to be wonderfully afflicted with the spleen, with the wind colic, and melancholy, obstruction in the bowel or small guts, small fevers, a remiss pulse. And as the sign Virgo is the sign ascending, and Moon and Mars therein, it argued the sixth was perplexed with distempers in his head, slept unquietly, and so on, all of which was true when he told the person this from reading the chart. So that's kind of a lot to take in. So again, we're looking at the fact that there's a majority of the key significators are in melancholic signs, giving like a windy, kind of unsettled, anxious experience. Very cold and dry disease here, which means that there's probably a lot of aches and pains. Like there could have been constipation because that deals with like retention. It's like holding things in. It could, deal with like just literally feeling very cold and very dry, like having chills and things like that. And we get basically a couple things here too. Earlier he said, because of the Mars ruling the 8th house and stuff, therefore from that house and sign must we require the disease cause and member grieved. And so I waited till now to comment on that, because I think what he's saying is that we have to look at both the sign Mars is in as well as the house it rules, the 8th house, right? So what we're getting here, this is kind of multi-layered. What we're getting is that Virgo refers to the small intestines and the guts, right? And the 8th house naturally refers to the colon. But the 8th sign is Aries. Sorry, I was distracted for a moment. The 8th sign is Aries, which rules the head, okay? And the 1st house also rules the head. So we kind of have this mixture of like the guts, the intestines, and the head doubly signified here, right? If that makes sense. Okay. So that's why that's why he's saying pain in the head, pain in the guts and so on, obstruction in the bowels, right? Because this person's probably very constipated, I would imagine.
Yeah, sure.
Right. He's retaining everything. It's cold and dry. It doesn't have the lubrication, the moisture to move from his body. So, pretty nasty looking stuff already, right? And and so that's kind of the logic that I think he's employing there. Did you want to say anything about that?
No, I think that's cool. I mean, you spoke precisely and you are to the point, so yeah, clear.
Okay, great. So then moving on, I persuaded the man to make his peace with God and to settle his house in order, for I did not perceive by natural causes that he could live above 10 or 12 days. So I want to pause here, because this is something that may disturb a lot of modern people. Maybe not you guys watching this video, because you're wanting to get into the nitty gritty here, but a lot of people would be disturbed by this. We are so scared of death in this day and age that we don't want to admit when it's a likelihood or a possibility. And oftentimes in my experiences, doctors pronounce death very erroneously. Like they say a person's going to die when they really don't know any better. How many stories have we all heard where the doctors are like, "Oh yeah, you don't have long to live," and then the person lives.
I have an experience of my own self.
There you go. Yeah, this happens all the time. And honestly, it happens because the doctors are not tuning in intuitively, and they're not using things like horary astrology. If I was a doctor, I would be using horary astrology all the time for all my patients, because I don't want to tell them that they're likely to die if I don't have a solid foundation for that, other than just my own biases based upon like statistics and, very questionable lines of thinking and research. So back then they didn't see medicine this way. They saw medicine holistically, and they saw life more holistically. And so even though there were problems in the Renaissance, Middle Ages and stuff, it's not, they were not afraid to say like, yeah, it looks like you are probably going to die according to the chart. Now, again, it's always, for these authors, it was always the final decision lay with God. And so that's why he's saying, I persuaded the man to make his peace with God and settle his house in order, for I did not perceive that he would, likely live past 10 or 12 days. This isn't this isn't fatalistic. This isn't negative. This is realistic, you know? This is a similar thing to like if a person gets like run over by a car and is like cut in half and is like bleeding out, you know they don't have long to live, right? So just like this may not be that kind of a situation, okay? But inwardly it is, because astrology is revealing the subtle energies and the subtle mechanisms at work, okay? And so whether this person, could have lived with, maybe if there were more advanced medical practices like there are today, like advanced surgical methods and medications and all kinds of machines that could keep you alive, I mean, okay, maybe, right? And that's not necessarily bad, but it's also not necessarily good, because sometimes the best thing for us is to die. So that way we can move on to the next phase of our, spiritual existence, which has to do with karma and fate and all these things. And so, yeah, I just wanted to pause to talk about that. Did you want to say anything about that?
No, I think it's pretty much done. But the thing is that maybe Lilly has kind of taken the really explicit placements and stuff that kind of directly indicate the person's disease. But what modern day astrologers might also add is they might take up some other angles and aspects that the planets found with other planets. Especially they look at the Lord of the Ascendant and the Lord of Illness, which is the sixth Lord, and so on. So, but it's interesting when we go back further in studying the traditional texts, things are far more straightforward and direct.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. So yeah, let's continue. And then I want to talk a little bit about the psychological, spiritual implications of this horary, which Lilly doesn't really talk about. And that's okay. It's not necessary always to, but again, it is possible to predict things like death with horary. Okay. I would only recommend doing it if the situation calls for it, though. Like I drew a horary chart up in the very beginning of my days in horary to see like when my grandmother would pass, because she was on her way out. And I learned a lot from it. I didn't predict it, but I learned a lot from it. And so, the thing of it is it is perfectly appropriate to predict death with horary in the right circumstances. If somebody's in a coma, for example, and the family member's like, well, I just really need to know, like, are they going to make it or not? Right. That's an important horary chart, because, you don't want to give them false hope. They should know what the likelihood is of the person waking up from the coma or not, of the person dying or not, and so on. But yeah, let's continue. Can you share the screen again?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. So moving on. And my reasons for this prediction were because all the significators did promise no less than death. For first, Sun, who is the temporal light at time of the question, and is fons vitalis potentiae, which means the potential fountain of life, so to speak, was in perfect square of Saturn, Lord of the Sixth, in fixed signs. And we can see that here. Some of you may have already seen that. The Sun is even applying to that square, making it a much more challenging aspect. And, this is, there's no reception. There's really nothing to mitigate this, right? They're just square. So, pretty intense situation. And Saturn is also, from a Hellenistic perspective, Saturn is in the 10th from the Sun. So this means he's in decimating the Sun. He's basically much more power within this square because he's in the 10th sign. So he's like from above. He's like an eagle striking from above its prey. Okay, so then secondly, the ascendant was extremely afflicted by the presence of Mars, being naturally ill, and accidentally almost the lord of the entire or whole 8th house, right? Like we talked about earlier. This Mars is, it's fairly close to the ascending degree, right? Which is about 6 degrees, right? So fairly close. And Mars is not really in a sign that's great for it. It doesn't have any dignity, right? It's, again, Hellenistically speaking, it is contrary to sect, which makes it very malefic. And it is occidental, meaning that it would rise over the horizon after the sun, making it even more malefic. So this is a very malefic Mars, okay? And there's no reception between Mars and the moon. So Mars is afflicting the moon, Mars is afflicting the ascendant, right? And the ascendant lord itself is even in the sign of Mars's fall, which is not great either for the person being able to deal with the disease, right? So that is something I will just add. Thirdly, the moon was near Cauda Leonis, which is a fixed star that I admittedly don't know much about, but I suppose it's, in this situation, it's not a good sign. And afflicted by the cross influence of Mars in that house, which signifies life, the ascendant. So the ascendant is the key house for life in any chart. Fourthly, the moon did separate from a sextile of Mercury, lord of the ascendant, in signs of long ascension, which is more properly like a square aspect, and did transfer his virtue to Jupiter, lord of the eighth. So for those of you who don't know, there's this interesting technique that Lilly employs quite frequently. It's very ancient, actually, and it's reminding me that I need to employ it more too, is that in the proper context, planets in signs of long ascension, which are Cancer to Sagittarius, become elongated so that a sextile acts like a square and a square acts like a trine. Planets in signs of short ascension, which would be Capricorn to Gemini, do the reverse. They shorten. So a square can shorten to a sextile, a trine to a square, and so on. With this square of Saturn to Sun, right, he's in the sign of short, Sun's in the sign of long, so it doesn't change, right, according to Lilly. But the context is also really important, right? Lilly's saying that this sextile should be treated more like a square because it is basically the sextile between Mercury and Moon, because it makes more sense within the context of everything else he's seeing. And so then what's happening is that the moon is transferring the light of Mercury to Jupiter, meaning that the moon is going to next aspect Jupiter. In about 10 degrees or so, a little less than 10, 11 degrees about, right? A little less than 11 degrees. So moon is applying to Jupiter, who is accidentally malefic here because he rules the 8th house cusp.
Yeah.
Right? Even though Jupiter is normally a benefic, even though they're in a square in mercurial signs, making it a little less challenging, but Lilly might say that square turns into a trine influence, which means that the passing is going to be actually fairly easy. You know,
I think the moon's separating aspect with Mercury sextile is probably one of the most key indicators here.
Yeah.
As moon is the life force, and and Mercury is the rising lord. So
yeah, I agree. We're going from the planet of life and self to the planet of death and endings, because even though actually Mars rules the fourth cusp, but Jupiter rules the majority of the fourth here, right? It's the natural fourth sign, and that deals with the end of life, the end of things. So Jupiter is doubly malefic here. He's also in the bounds of Saturn and in Gemini, which Lilly would have considered detriment for Jupiter.
Yeah, for sure, yes.
So Jupiter is actually quite malefic in this chart because of the context more than anything else, right? And we even see Jupiter aspecting by trine the lot of Fortune, which is interesting because Fortune also deals with life and things like that. I'm going to talk about that more in a bit after we get through Lilly's analysis. But, we're seeing a lot of significations here, and I think you're right. Like, Moon is leaving that sextile with Mercury. He's leaving life, the mind, the subtle body. You could even say the soul, even though I don't consider the moon the soul, but it's metaphorically, the soul is disconnecting from the body here. The mind is disconnecting from the body, right? The subtle energies are dispersing. And Jupiter has a strange association with death sometimes in astrology, because he's like that last breath that we take. He's like that expansive, like, okay, now it's time, Jupiter in Pisces, right, to expand beyond the limits of the body, right? Saturn comes along and like kills us, so to speak, and says like, okay, like you're going, this is the end. And then Jupiter is like that final breath where we expand beyond the body.
Yeah.
Cool. So fourthly, the moon. Oh, I already read that. Sorry. So I'm at the final paragraph now. The sick died the 28th of July following. So that's about, well, I don't know. I mean, that would be 2 days later. So again, I don't know. We don't know if Lilly said this was the 16th, but it clearly something's up with the date, right? So who knows? But the sick died the 28th of July following, Mercury coming to the degree of the sun in the question. So Mercury transited to the 3 degrees Leo, and therein to the square of Saturn, right, Lord of the Sixth, the day preceding. And the moon to an opposition of the sun, which makes sense. A lot of people leave around a full moon. Sometimes people may leave around a new moon as well. But I remember one of my grandmothers and one of my grandfathers, I think both died like very close to a full moon, actually. And I think that's quite common. It's just it's a natural time to leave because the energies, the veil between the worlds is more naturally open. So, and then so the moon to an opposition of the sun, although I'm not sure if he means to an opposition of the sun like the full moon, or if he means to just an opposition of the sun in the chart. But either way, it's kind of, they're still kind of the same thing in a way, even though, one would be more symbolical. Anyway, the moon that day transiting the degree of the 6th house at the time of the question. So I guess the moon was right on the 6th house cusp, which leads me to believe that, it would have been in a full moon opposite the sun. Yeah, okay, cool. And at the time of the question, about 14 degrees of Aquarius. So this date is not quite right. It would have been a good 10, 12 days later, like Lilly predicted. And the sun was transiting the cusp of the 12th. So this is full moon right on this cusp. 12th house has to do with endings, right? The 12th, 4th, and 8th all have to do with death as like endings and moksha, right? The final release, so to speak. So that's Lilly's analysis. I think it's an incredible analysis, and he's once again flawless. So I think I just want to add some other things here too, like we talked about doing. So we have this cold and dry disease afflicting the bowels and whatnot, but we have a few other things to look at. We have the Lord of the Lot of Fortune, Venus, combust with the sun, right? Not a good indicator of life. Combust planets can show death in a chart about death. So, in a hot and dry sign with the sun, and like I said, we have the 8th Lord making a trine to that lot of fortune. It's really one of the closest aspects, aside from Mercury making the square. But it's also in the bound. Which might
probably make the passing easier.
Sure. I think it probably did too. And Jupiter, just being the Lord of the 8th, will make the passing easier, less horrible. Than Mars or Saturn alone. And Jupiter is, the lot of fortune is also in the bounds of Jupiter, again, making Jupiter's influence more complete here than Mercury's might be normally. We have, interestingly enough, the North Node in the 12th house, which augurs kind of this is sort of where the person is headed to, in a sense. This is it's the head of the dragon, right? So they're headed.
Desire to kind of end things. Yes.
The person is ready to end things.
Mm-hmm.
The person is tired of feeling stuck and being sick. So Lilly doing this probably really helped the person psychologically, actually, to let go and pass on. For some people, it's a relief when they're really ill and they're like, I want to leave, but I feel guilty. Like, I don't want to leave people behind. That can be the type of thing where it's like, no, it's okay. Like, it is time for you to pass. The stars are showing that it's time for you to go. I think that's a really beautiful thing, personally. But back to this fiery stuff, right? We have Mars creating fire. We have Venus sun showing fiery stuff. We have obstructed fire with Saturn aspecting the sun, and with Mars being in a cold, dry sign, and normally being a hot, dry, choleric, fiery planet. So I just kind of thought this was interesting because, like, psychologically, what is happening for this person? You know, this is probably something we would find replicated in the chart, this sort of pattern of, like, this person really wants to do something, but they feel stifled. They feel impotent on some level. Like, did they feel, were they never themselves fully? Did they never take the risks that they wanted to take because they had guilt, they had fear, they had like a rigidity around things like weighing them down, you know? Like, I don't know, but that's kind of brings that to light to me. Like, there are a lot of fortune, you know, which can symbolize just like a basic level of happiness. You know, the Lord is in the 8th or the 12th here with the sun, the 12th Lord. You know, this is not really indicating the happiest of people necessarily.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of astrologers don't necessarily feel comfortable going here where I'm going. But I felt like it was important to talk about this because disease and illness are always a manifestation of energetic blockages within the person's psyche and subtle constitution. All major diseases arise out of basically, you could say, like, very challenging karmas and very unwholesome or inharmonious samskaras and vasanas, to kind of bring in the Indian terminology, which I love to use because it works so well. But what I'm basically saying is that vasanas, which are thought and feeling patterns, become samskaras, which are like deep grooves, like in a record, you know, which are basically become our personality, our habits, right? Our behavioral habits and qualities. Like, you know, oh, that person's curmudgeonly, or that person's pessimistic, or that person's really nostalgic, or that person's really joyous and buoyant, and that person's really jovial, or whatever. Any quality, harmonious or inharmonious, could be considered, in a sense, a samskara of some kind. So they're not bad or good, they just are what they are. But we clearly see here like samskaras indicating, you know, blockages to joy and enjoyment. We've got Saturn in a Venus sign, and we've got the part of fortune in a Venus sign with the Lord in not so great condition. You know, we've even got Mercury, the ascendant Lord, in a sign that is the fall of Mars, on some level showing that this person has a hard time with Mars stuff, and probably did their whole life. You know, they, Lord One, have a hard time with Mars things, right? Mars things being like risk and action, initiative, right? Adventure, boldness, courage, right? They were probably never quite as courageous and bold as they really could be, because they were always worried, you know. Virgo,
Yeah.
worry about this stuff. Like, what's going to happen if I really just take these risks and be myself? So, and we even see that with the South Node in the 6th, which is a naturally Martian house, you know, and it's even almost in the bounds of Mars. It's like practically in the bounds of Mars, you know. It's like, okay, this person had a hard time with 6th house things, and 6th house things positively are, again, related to Mars, like kind of going against the grain, you know, like being willing to make mistakes and, you know, kind of defy things, defy people. In Indian astrology, the text Parashara, he calls it the rogue bhava. Yeah. Bhava means state of mind or house. So the rogue house, like what's a rogue? You know, like a roguish person is somebody that's kind of out for themselves and sort of cheats other people. But I think positively, a roguish person is just somebody who is like a maverick that just sort of does things their own way. And as a result, they get into trouble. The show Luther is a great example of a maverick. The character Luther, played by Idris Elba, is a detective in London who is really, really good, really intelligent, like a really awesome dude who just sort of does whatever he needs to do to catch these like criminals and killers. But as a result, he breaks protocol all the time. You know, he breaks free of the rules, and he gets himself into a lot of trouble, like a lot of trouble, but he always gets the job done. And, you know, so that character has to have a very strong Mars, very strong sixth house, you know, theoretically. And we're just seeing here in this Horary chart, you know, South Node in the sixth, Mars not in a great sign for Mars, Occidental, and so on. This person probably had a lot of uncontrollable urges, or I should say repressed urges, and potentially controllable anger on some level, you know.
Yeah, and burden as well to some extent.
Yeah, Saturn square Sun, right? Like they're not being themselves.
Yeah,
here.
And Venus is combust again, not ready to mingle and move along with people. Probably an isolated life, but not really isolated. Yeah. I mean, dwelling deep into illusions and finding themselves into nothingness or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, possibly with Rahu in the 12th here, this could also be showing unexplored sexual desires as well. Confusion surrounding love and things like this. You know, we even have the 8th cusp in the 7th sign, right? Jupiter rules both. So is there some link romantically for this person? Was their heart broken? Did they have a hard time with their marriage, with love? You know,
there must have been some kind of hardship with regards to relationships because of Venus's
Venus's difficult state. I mean, at the end of the day, these are not necessarily important things to tell a person who's dying. I don't think Lilly, you know, should have talked about these things to this person, but these are useful things to understand, especially in our modern day when people are looking for something more, you know. Now, you still don't tell a dying person this. If you see that they are dying, you don't tell them these things unless it's going to help, right? These things are probably not going to help a dying person make peace and whatnot. They're probably just going to worry the person more and inspire more guilt. But if somebody comes to you and asks about an illness, right, like, you know, instead of only dealing with the fact that, oh, well, you've got more melancholy and you've got some problems with the fiery humor and so on, right? You can go deeper and deal with the psycho-spiritual level like we're doing here if the person is open, and tell them, well, like the main problem here, this disease you have is actually a manifestation of your repressed desires and urges surrounding like your own creative self-actualization and risk-taking and boldness and courage, right? Because that's something a person can deal with more directly, if they're so inclined, basically. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say about that. And I think that does it for me with this one. So yeah, thanks for having me on. This was a really fun video, and hopefully it wasn't too long.
I mean, it doesn't matter how long it is, but I'm also really looking forward to this series because I think Horary is kind of, I got the Horary bug as it is. So
Cool.
So okay,
yeah,
then yeah. So yeah, we'll get back with another video, and bye bye.
Okay, great.